For years, the world watched Angelina Jolie as a movie star, an Oscar winner, a humanitarian, one of the most recognizable women in Hollywood. But there was another role that slowly became more important than all of those titles. Mother. And Angelina did not become a mother to one child. She became the mother of six. 6 children, 6 different personalities, 6 different paths, and 6 lives that would eventually grow far beyond the Hollywood family the world thought it knew. But here is the part of their story that is easy to miss. When people talk about what Angelina Jolie gave her children, they usually talk about their opportunities. The education, the travel, their exposure to different cultures, the protection she tried to give them from the world around them. But what if that is only half of the story? Because while Angelina was raising them, they were changing her too. The woman who once seemed to live almost entirely under the Hollywood spotlight began to see her life through the eyes of her children. Her priorities changed. Her understanding of family changed. And in ways she has spoken about publicly, motherhood gave her a reason to look beyond herself. The children who were once photographed beside her at airports, on red carpets, in foreign countries, and outside their family home, were slowly becoming their own people. Maddox, Pax, Zahara, Shiloh, Knox, Vivienne. They did not all choose the same path. They did not all follow their mother into acting. And they did not all seem interested in becoming famous simply because their parents were famous. Instead, each began searching for something of their own. And that may reveal something important about the woman who raised them. Because perhaps Angelina's greatest gift to her children was not giving them a life in Hollywood. Perhaps it was giving them the freedom to imagine a life beyond Hollywood. But then comes the other side of the story. What did those 6 children give Angelina Jolie in return? What did motherhood teach a woman who had already experienced fame, success, humanitarian work, love, loss, and extraordinary public attention? And how did 6 children quietly become part of the person Angelina Jolie would eventually become? This is not simply the story of a famous mother and her famous children. It is the story of a relationship that changed in both directions. First, she was raising them, and then they began changing her. And perhaps, after everything the world has said about Angelina Jolie and her family, that is the part of the story we have never looked at closely enough. Long before her children were old enough to understand what Hollywood meant, Angelina Jolie was already trying to show them something else. A world beyond Hollywood. For most celebrity children, growing up in Los Angeles can mean growing up inside a very small bubble. Private schools, gated homes, red carpets, cameras, famous friends. A life where ordinary things can become extraordinary simply because of the family name. But Angelina's children were exposed to a very different picture of the world. Their family life was shaped not only by Hollywood, but by travel, different cultures, humanitarian work, and the reality that millions of people lived lives completely different from their own. And that distinction matters, because Angelina had already spent years traveling internationally through her humanitarian work. She had seen refugee camps. She had met families living through war and displacement. She had seen poverty and uncertainty in places far removed from the world of movie premieres and celebrity parties. And eventually, those experiences became part of the world her children saw too. They were not simply children growing up with a famous mother. They were children growing up with a mother who repeatedly tried to remind them that fame was only one small part of life. That may be one of the most important things she gave them. Perspective. Not the perspective that they were more important because they were famous, but almost their opposite. The understanding that there was an enormous world outside the one they had been born into. Angelina has spoken publicly about the importance of exposing her children to different cultures and allowing them to learn from the world around them. And this was reflected in the family's travels. The children grew up with connections to different countries and cultures through their family background, and through the places they visited with their mother. Maddox was born in Cambodia. Zahara was born in Ethiopia. Pax was born in Vietnam. Shiloh, Knox, and Vivienne were born in the United States. 6 children, different beginnings, different experiences. And yet, Angelina's approach was not to erase those differences. It was to let those differences become part of the family. That is important because there is a difference between telling children that the world is diverse and actually allowing them to experience that diversity. For Angelina, motherhood did not appear to mean creating 6 children who all looked and behaved the same. It meant creating a family in which different histories could exist under the same roof. And perhaps that was especially significant because of their extraordinary circumstances surrounding their childhood. They were never going to have a completely ordinary upbringing. Their parents were among the most recognizable people on the planet. Every family photograph could become a magazine cover. Every airport appearance could become a news story. Even a normal family outing could attract cameras. So Angelina faced a challenge that most parents never have to consider. How do you give children a sense of normal life when their entire world is watching? One answer was to make their world bigger. If Hollywood was going to be part of their childhood, then it would not be the whole childhood. There would be travel. There would be school. There would be family time. There would be exposure to other cultures. There would be opportunities to see people whose lives had nothing to do with movies or celebrity. And there would be an emphasis on learning. That idea becomes even more interesting when we look at what happened as the children grew older. Because they did not all emerge from that environment with the same ambitions. Maddox developed an interest in filmmaking. Pax explored visual art and work behind the camera. Zahara pursued education and became involved in leadership and philanthropy. Shiloh developed her own interests, including dance. Vivienne became involved in theater. Knox remained comparatively private and pursued interests of his own. Their paths were different, and that difference may have been part of the point. The goal was never necessarily to create 6 little versions of Angelina Jolie. If anything, the family story suggests the opposite. Angelina had given them access to a world most children could never see. But access is not the same as direction. She could open doors. She could introduce them to places. She could expose them to ideas. But eventually, they would have to decide which doors they wanted to walk through. And that is where this story becomes more complicated. Because giving children freedom is not the same thing as giving them a completely unrestricted life. Angelina was still their mother. She still had to protect them. She still had to make decisions for them when they were young. She still had to raise 6 children while living under extraordinary public scrutiny. And the more famous the family became, the more difficult that balance became. There were cameras outside. There were headlines about their parents. There were constant questions about their family. And yet the children continued to grow. They went to school. They developed friendships. They found interests. They began working on creative projects. And eventually, they started making decisions that belonged to them. That is why the most meaningful part of Angelina's parenting story may not be the places she took them. It may be the worldview she tried to give them. A child who grows up believing the world ends at Hollywood may eventually measure success by fame. A child who grows up seeing a much larger world may define success differently. And the public record gives us glimpses of that difference. Not all 6 children wanted to become actors. Not all of them sought the spotlight. Not all of them tried to turn their family name into a career. Instead, their interests began moving in different directions. And that is perhaps one of the clearest signs that Angelina gave them something more valuable than a Hollywood education. She gave them room to become different from one another. Room 2 discover interests that had nothing to do with acting. Room 2 experience cultures beyond their own. And eventually, Room 2 decide who they wanted to be. But there is another side to this. Because Angelina may have believed she was teaching her children about the world. What she could not have known when they were young was that they would eventually begin teaching her about the world too. The little boy from Cambodia. The little girl from Ethiopia. The little boy from Vietnam. The 3 children born in America. They entered her life at different moments. They carried different histories. And they each brought a different perspective into the same family. At first, she was the one opening their eyes. But as they grew older, they began opening hers. And that is where the story changes. Because the next chapter is no longer about what a famous mother gave her children. It is about what happened when those children became old enough to give something back. And that is when motherhood began changing Angelina Jolie in ways the world could actually see. Perhaps the clearest sign of Angelina Jolie's influence on her children is not that they became like her. It is that they did not. 6 children grew up inside the same extraordinary family. They shared the same parents. They lived under the same enormous spotlight. They traveled together. They experienced many of the same family events. And yet, as they became older, their interests began moving in very different directions. That difference matters, because when your parents are Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, there is an obvious path available to you. Hollywood, acting, fame, red carpets, the family name. The world is already waiting for you to become famous. But the 6 children did not all move toward that path. Maddox developed an interest in filmmaking and eventually began gaining experience behind the camera. He worked on film productions and learned about the industry from the production side, rather than simply appearing in front of it. That distinction is important. He could have entered Hollywood simply as Angelina Jolie's son. Instead, his professional experience began to develop through actual work on film sets. And then there was Pax. His interests moved toward visual art and creative work. Again, not necessarily toward becoming another famous actor. Another direction. Another identity. Then came Zahara. Her story took a different turn altogether. Education became an important part of her life. At Spelman College, she found an environment where she could develop her own identity outside the immediate shadow of her family. She became involved in student leadership and philanthropy. And suddenly, the daughter of one of Hollywood's most famous women was being seen for something other than the name she was born with. Then there was Shiloh. 4 years. The public had watched her grow up. But as she became older, her own interests began to emerge. Dance became one of the areas in which she expressed herself. Again, something different. Something that belonged to her. Not to Angelina. Not to Brad. Not to Hollywood. To Shiloh. And then came Vivienne. Her path brought her closer to theater. But even here, the story is more interesting than simply saying she followed her mother. Vivienne did not need to become an actress to participate in theater. Instead, she became involved in the world behind a production. She worked alongside Angelina on the stage production of The Outsiders. That is a very different kind of connection. A daughter working beside her mother. Not simply as a celebrity child, but as someone learning about theater and production. And then there is Knox. Perhaps the most difficult of the 6 to understand from their outside. Because Knox has generally lived a more private life. The public has seen photographs. There have been occasional appearances. There have been glimpses of his interests. But compared with some of his siblings, there has been far less information about the life he is building. And that itself tells us something. Not every child raised by famous parents needs to become publicly visible. Some may want the spotlight. Some may work behind it. Some may use their family platform for education or philanthropy. And some may simply want more privacy. 6 children, 6 different answers. And perhaps that is the most interesting part of Angelina's parenting story. She did not raise 6 copies of herself. She did not raise 6 actors. She did not create 6 people whose purpose was to continue the Jolie brand. Instead, the public record shows 6 young people developing different interests and different relationships with the world around them. Of course, we should be careful here. We cannot know everything these children think. We cannot know what they privately want for their futures. And we should not turn a few public appearances into assumptions about their personalities. But we can look at their observable choices. And those choices are remarkably different. That is where the story becomes more meaningful. Because perhaps giving a child freedom is not about telling them what to become. It is about allowing them to discover what they are not. Maddox did not have to become Brad Pitt. Pax did not have to become Angelina Jolie. Zahara did not have to become a Hollywood celebrity. Shiloh did not have to follow either parent. Vivienne did not have to become an actress simply because she was raised around actors. And Knox did not have to live his life in front of cameras. They could be different. And in a family where almost everything about them was public, that difference may have been one of the few things they could truly make their own. There is another reason this matters. Celebrity children are often treated as extensions of their parents. When a famous actor has a child, the public immediately asks, will the child act? Will they become famous? Will they look like their father? Will they inherit their mother's talent? Will they continue the family legacy? But children are not family legacies. They are people. And perhaps Angelina's greatest success as a mother was understanding that distinction. The family name could open doors. It could create opportunities. It could make almost any introduction possible. But it could not tell these children who they were supposed to become. That decision had to come later. And it appears that each child has been allowed to approach that decision differently. This also helps explain why their stories cannot simply be combined into one narrative. Maddox's relationship with filmmaking tells us something different from Zahara's experience at college. Pax's creative interests tell us something different from Shiloh's connection to dance. Vivienne's theater experience tells us something different from Knox's quieter public presence. They are not 6 chapters of the same story. They are 6 separate stories that happen to begin inside the same family. And perhaps that is exactly what Angelina wanted. A family does not have to produce identical lives to remain a family. Sometimes the strongest sign that children have been given room to grow is that they eventually stop looking like extensions of their parents. They start becoming themselves. But there was a deeper lesson hidden inside all of this. Because while Angelina was giving her children space to become individuals, those individual personalities were beginning to affect her. A mother learns from her children too. Not in the same way children learn from parents, but through watching them grow, through seeing their fears, their confidence, their interests, their differences, their independence. And eventually, the parent who once made almost every decision has to learn something much harder. How to let go. That transition was coming for Angelina. The children who once needed her to choose their schools, their schedules, their meals, their travels, and their daily lives would eventually become young adults capable of making their own choices. And when that happened, Angelina's role would have to change. She could no longer simply be the person showing them the world. She would have to become the person watching them choose their place in it. And that is where something remarkable happened. The relationship began to move in the opposite direction. For years, Angelina had been giving protection, giving opportunity, giving perspective, giving her children access to a world far beyond Hollywood. But as the children grew older, they began giving something back. Not money, not fame, not another Hollywood headline. Something much more personal. a different reason for their mother to see the world. And that is where the story begins to turn. Because the next chapter is not about the 6 children becoming independent. It is about the woman they helped Angelina Jolie become. For years, the relationship seemed to move in only one direction. Angelina was the mother. She made the decisions. She protected them. She introduced them to the world. She taught them. She carried them when they were small. And she tried to create a sense of stability inside a life that was anything but ordinary. But children do not stay children. Eventually, something changes. The parent who once answered every question begins listening to the answers their children give. The parent who once showed them the world begins seeing that world through their eyes. And that is what happened to Angelina Jolie. She has spoken about this transformation herself. In a 2019 interview, she said that her children knew her true self and had helped her find it again and embrace it. She also said that she learned from their strength. That is a remarkable statement, because Angelina was not describing her children simply as people she loved. She was describing them as people who had influenced the woman she was becoming. And perhaps the most powerful example came years later. In 2023, while discussing her life and the changes she had experienced, Angelina said that becoming a mother at 26 changed her entire life. She went even further. She said that having children had saved her and taught her to be in the world differently. She explained that during a difficult period, she believed she might have gone in a much darker direction if she had not wanted to live for her children. Those are Angelina's words. And they changed the way we should look at this family. Because suddenly, motherhood is no longer just something Angelina gave. It became something that gave her a reason to keep moving. A reason to keep building. A reason to think about tomorrow. Her children were not responsible for fixing her life. That would be an unfair burden to place on any child. But Angelina herself said they gave her a reason to live differently. And that distinction matters. They did not save her because they were perfect. They saved her because being their mother gave her a responsibility and a connection that went beyond herself. 6 people were depending on her. 6 people were watching her. 6 people needed her to be there. And sometimes, that kind of responsibility can change the way a person sees everything. But there was something else Angelina noticed. As the children became older, they were no longer simply following her. They were influencing the family. They were developing their own personalities, their own humor, their own opinions, their own interests. And Angelina acknowledged this in that same 2023 interview. She said that she hoped to be a safe place and a source of stability for them. But she also joked that she was the person they laughed at. And she could see them taking over different aspects of the family. That small observation tells us something much bigger. The family was no longer organized entirely around the mother. The children were becoming a force within the family themselves. That is what happens when children grow up. At first, everything revolves around them because they need you. Then slowly, they become people with ideas of their own. They challenge you. They surprise you. They make you laugh. Sometimes they make you question your own assumptions. And eventually, they become people you can learn from. Angelina has also described how different her children are from one another. In a British Vogue interview, she explained that her children came from different parts of the world and that the family had been blessed with different cultures and backgrounds. She said they were all learning from one another. That phrase is important. Learning from one another. Not simply Angelina teaching 6 children. The children learning from each other. And Angelina learning alongside them. She also explained something else that reveals her approach to motherhood. She said that she could not force anything on any of them. They were all very different. That may sound simple, but inside a family as famous as this one, it becomes much more significant. because the public often expects celebrity families to behave like brands. Everyone has a recognizable image. Everyone appears at the same events. Everyone follows the same path. But Angelina described something much more complicated. 6 individuals. Not one unit. Not 6 copies. Individuals. And that meant Angelina herself had to evolve. The mother of a young child does not have the same job as the mother of a teenager. And the mother of teenagers does not have the same relationship with them once they become adults. The rules change. The conversations change. The responsibilities change. And perhaps most importantly, the balance of power changes. When a child is 5 years old, the parent decides where the family goes. When that child is 25, the parent can no longer decide. All they can do is hope that the values they gave them remain useful. That transition appears to have been especially meaningful to Angelina. In a 2021 interview, she described her children as pretty great people and said that because there were so many of them, they had a significant effect on each other. She also said something revealing about her own role. She did not see herself as the head of everything. She described herself as very honest and very human with her children. And she said she had allowed herself to evolve as they moved from childhood into their teenage years and young adulthood. That is a very different picture of celebrity motherhood. It is not the image of an untouchable Hollywood star giving instructions to her children. It is a woman admitting that she is changing too. And perhaps that is one of the greatest gifts children can give a parent. They force you to keep changing. You cannot remain the same person forever when 6 other people are growing around you. Their questions change. Their interests change. Their needs change. And eventually, your understanding of yourself has to change with them. Angelina's own childhood may also help explain why this mattered to her. She has spoken about her relationship with her mother, Marceline Bertrand, and about how her mother encouraged her individuality rather than trying to turn her into a version of herself. In a 2021 interview, Angelina recalled that her mother saw her true self and encouraged it. She said that experience taught her to do the same for her own children. And then she made an observation that could almost serve as the philosophy behind this entire story. Her children, she said, were all very different from each other. So the lesson had come full circle. Her mother had taught Angelina to see her own individuality. Angelina tried to give that same freedom to her children. And then those children began reflecting that freedom back to her. It became a cycle. One generation teaching another. And then the younger generation quietly teaching the older one. But there is one moment in Angelina's story that makes this even more powerful. She did not only say that her children had changed her. She said they had helped her find something in herself that she had lost. After years of pain and difficult experiences, she described her children as people who knew her true self. And through them, she began finding that part of herself again. That does not mean motherhood erased every difficulty. It did not. It does not mean her children were responsible for her healing. They were not. And it would be wrong to romanticize a complicated family story that way. But it does mean something important. The children gave Angelina a reason to keep moving forward while she was still figuring out who she wanted to be. And perhaps that is why the story of this family is more interesting than simply asking what Angelina gave her children. Because eventually, their exchange became mutual. She gave them a world. They gave her perspective. She gave them opportunities. They gave her reasons to keep growing. She tried to teach them individuality. They reminded her that she was allowed to be an individual too. And she tried to give them a safe place, while they, in their own way, became a place where she could be human. Not Angelina Jolie the actress. Not Angelina Jolie the humanitarian. Not Angelina Jolie the celebrity. Just their mother. The woman they could laugh at. The woman who could make mistakes. The woman who was still learning. And perhaps that is the most unexpected part of this entire story. The world spent decades watching Angelina Jolie become extraordinary. But her children may have been the people who reminded her that she did not always need to be extraordinary. Sometimes she simply needed to be there. And as those 6 children grew older, that lesson became even more important. Because eventually, the mother who had spent years protecting them would have to watch them step into a world she could no longer control. And that would bring Angelina to the next stage of motherhood. Not raising them, not protecting them, but watching them become themselves. And that is where we begin to see something even deeper. The woman her children helped her become. There is a moment in every parent's life when the relationship with a child begins to change. At first, the child needs you for almost everything. You choose. You protect. You explain. You decide. But eventually, the child becomes someone who has a voice of their own. And then something unexpected happens. The parent begins to see the world differently. For Angelina Jolie, that transformation did not happen overnight. It happened gradually, through 6 different children, 6 different personalities, and countless small moments that the public would never see. The world knew Angelina as a woman who had already lived several lives. Actress, Oscar winner, humanitarian, mother, but behind all those public identities was another person. A woman who, by her own account, had gone through periods when she did not feel entirely like herself. In 2023, Angelina told Vogue that she did not feel like she had been herself for about a decade. She described that period as a difficult one and said that she had lost some of the qualities of herself that she valued. But there was something that remained. Her children, and they became part of the reason she continued moving forward. That does not mean her children were responsible for her emotional well-being. They were children. They were not therapists. They were not responsible for healing their mother. But Angelina herself has described motherhood as something that fundamentally changed her. She became a person who had to think beyond herself. A person who had 6 other lives connected to her own. And that responsibility can change a person in ways that fame never can. Fame asks, how does the world see me? Motherhood asks, what does this person need from me? Those are completely different questions. And perhaps that difference slowly changed Angelina. Before motherhood, her public image was built around individuality. She was unconventional, independent, sometimes unpredictable. She had built a career around playing complicated characters and refusing to fit neatly into expectations. But motherhood introduced a different kind of responsibility. Suddenly, being independent was not enough. She also had to be dependable. She had to be present. She had to think about the future. And she had to understand that her decisions would affect people who had not chosen her life. Her children had. In a sense, motherhood forced Angelina to become less interested in the person the world expected her to be, and more interested in the person her children needed her to be. That distinction may explain why some of her later comments about motherhood sound surprisingly humble. She has not presented herself as a perfect parent. Quite the opposite. She has acknowledged that parenting is something she is still learning. And perhaps that is one of the most revealing things about her. Because the woman who spent years being treated as an authority on beauty, fame, acting, and humanitarian work was willing to admit that she was still figuring out motherhood. She could not control who her children would become. She could not decide what their passions would be. She could not choose their personalities. She could only create their environment and then watch. And watching may be one of the hardest things for a parent to learn. You can hold a child's hand when they are small, but you cannot hold it forever. Eventually, they have to walk somewhere without you. That is what happened with the Jolie children. Maddox became an adult. Pax grew older. Zahara went to college. Shiloh began developing her own interests. Vivienne became involved in theater. Knox continued growing into his own person. The children who once appeared beside Angelina, as little kids, were becoming young adults with their own identities. And that changed her role. She could no longer be the woman standing in front of them, telling them what the world was. She had to become the woman standing beside them, listening to how they saw it. That is a profound change. And it may be one of the most important things her children gave her. Perspective. Not the perspective of a humanitarian visiting another country. Not the perspective of a celebrity reading headlines. But the perspective of a mother watching 6 human beings become individuals. Every child sees something differently. One may be fearless. Another cautious. One may be artistic. Another analytical. One may want attention. Another may avoid it. And when you have 6 children, you cannot rely on one formula. You have to adapt. You have to listen. You have to learn. Angelina has spoken about how different her children are from one another. That difference appears to have become something she values, rather than something she tries to eliminate. And perhaps this is where her own childhood enters the story. Angelina has spoken often about her mother, Marceline Bertrand. Her mother was an important influence on her life. And Angelina has described how her mother encouraged her individuality. She did not simply want Angelina to become a copy of herself. She wanted her daughter to discover who she was. That memory seems to have followed Angelina into her own motherhood. The lesson became let them be themselves. And perhaps the 6 children eventually taught her the same lesson. Let yourself be yourself too. Because mothers can lose themselves. Especially mothers who spend years being responsible for everyone else. They can become the organizer, the protector, the person who remembers every appointment, every schedule, every need, every problem, and somewhere inside all of that responsibility, they can forget who they were before they became someone's mother. Angelina has spoken about that tension. She has described herself as someone who had been focused on her children and who had spent years putting their needs first. That may sound admirable, but it also carries a hidden cost. A mother can become so focused on protecting her children that she forgets to protect parts of herself. And perhaps the children eventually helped Angelina recognize that. Not because they told her to, but because watching them grow reminded her that individuality matters. They were becoming themselves, so she had to rediscover herself too. That is why the title of this story works in both directions. What Angelina gave her children, and what they gave her back. She gave them a family. They gave her a reason to keep building one. She gave them a wider world. They gave her new ways of seeing it. She gave them freedom to become different. They reminded her that she could change too. She tried to protect their childhood. They eventually gave her the courage to imagine her own next chapter. And that last part is especially important. Because children growing up means something else. It means parents eventually have to face their own future. For years, Angelina's identity was tied to being the mother of young children. Their schedules, their schooling, their travels, their daily lives. But as the children became adults, that chapter began closing. And suddenly, Angelina had to ask herself a question that many parents eventually face. Who am I when my children no longer need me in the same way? That question can be frightening, but it can also be liberating. Because motherhood does not end when children become adults. It changes. Their relationship becomes less about control and more about connection. Less about protection, and more about trust. Less about telling them where to go, and more about being there when they come back. And perhaps Angelina's children were preparing her for exactly that transition. They were becoming independent. and she was learning how to let them go. Not emotionally, not completely, but developmentally. They had to become their own people, and she had to become more of her own person again. That may be one reason Angelina has increasingly spoken about wanting a life beyond their intense pressure of Hollywood. Her children did not simply give her a family. They gave her a reason to imagine a life that did not revolve around fame. And that may be the quiet transformation at the center of this entire story. The world spent years asking Angelina Jolie, what movie are you making next? What award will you win next? What will you wear next? What will you do next? But motherhood gave her a different question. What kind of life are we building together? And perhaps that question mattered more. Because careers have endings. Movies end. Awards gather dust. Headlines disappear. But the relationship between a mother and her children continues to evolve. That is the part of Angelina's life the cameras can never fully capture. The private conversations, the family jokes, the disagreements, the small moments, the children becoming adults, and a mother realizing that the people she once carried are now walking beside her. 6 children entered Angelina Jolie's life. But somewhere along the way, they became more than children she was raising. They became mirrors, each one reflecting something different back to her. Strength, independence, creativity, compassion, curiosity, and the simple reminder that life is bigger than the image the world creates of you. Perhaps Angelina gave her children the freedom to become themselves. And in return, they gave her permission to become herself again. But there was still one final stage. Because eventually, the children who had once been her greatest responsibility would become adults. They would leave childhood behind. They would make choices their mother could not make for them. And Angelina would have to discover what motherhood means when the children no longer need to be raised, but simply need to know that their mother is still there. And that brings us to the final chapter. The children who began as Angelina Jolie's responsibility and slowly became part of her legacy. There is something a parent learns only with time. You can give your children everything you possibly can. You can protect them, teach them, travel with them, stand beside them, try to prepare them for a world that will not always be kind. But eventually, you have to let them become people you cannot control. That is where Angelina Jolie is now. The 6 children who once needed their mother to make almost every decision are growing into adults who can make decisions of their own. And that changes the meaning of motherhood. When they were young, Angelina's job was to give them roots. Now her job is to let them grow. And when we look at the 6 children today, one thing becomes clear. They did not become one thing. They became 6 different people. Maddox found a connection to filmmaking and production. Pax developed his own creative interests. Zahara pursued education and leadership. Shiloh explored dance and her own identity. Vivienne found a place in theater. And Knox has continued to grow more quietly, away from much of the public attention surrounding his family. Their lives are still developing. Their futures are not completely writ. And that is important, because these are not finished stories. They are beginning stories. The world may still describe them as the Jolie Pitt children. But increasingly, that label tells us less about who they are. Maddox is not simply Angelina's son. Zahara is not simply the daughter of an Oscar-winning actress. Shiloh is not simply the child of 2 Hollywood stars. Vivienne is not simply Angelina's youngest daughter. Knox is not simply one half of a famous set of twins. And Pax is not simply another member of the Jolie Pitt family. They are becoming adults. And adulthood means choosing what parts of your family history you want to carry forward. And what parts you want to leave behind. That may be one of the most important lessons Angelina gave them. A famous family name can open a door, but it cannot walk through the door for you. Eventually, each of these children has to decide what their own life will mean. And perhaps that is why the story of this family should not end with fame. It should end with identity. Because Angelina did not simply give her children access to Hollywood. She gave them access to a much larger world. Different countries, different cultures, different experiences, different possibilities, and perhaps most importantly, the possibility of becoming different from one another. That may be the true measure of what she gave them. Not that they all became successful. Not that they all followed the same path. Not even that they remained close in exactly the same way. But that they were given room to become themselves. And now they are giving something back to her. Not in the way Hollywood usually measures success. They are not giving her awards. They are not giving her box office numbers. They are not making her more famous. They are giving her something much harder to measure. A reason to keep looking forward. A reason to see the future differently. A reason to remain connected to the world beyond herself. And perhaps after everything Angelina Jolie has experienced, that may be the most valuable gift of all. Because celebrity can make a person feel as though the world is always watching. Motherhood can make you realize that the people who matter most are not necessarily watching from the outside. They are sitting across the dinner table. They are asking questions. They are making jokes. They are growing up. They are challenging you. They are becoming people you admire. And one day, they become people you have to trust. That is the final transformation. Angelina once carried these children. Now they carry pieces of her. Not because they have to. Not because they are expected to. But because every parent leaves something behind in their children. A phrase. A value. A memory. A way of looking at the world. A sense of compassion. A sense of independence. A reminder that life can be bigger than fame. And that children leave something behind in their mother too. Their voices. Their personalities. Their experiences. Their differences. Their courage to become individuals. Their refusal to be reduced to one family story. 6 children. 6 different paths. And one mother watching them slowly walk into the future. Perhaps this is what legacy really looks like. It is not a statue. It is not an award. It is not a name writ across a Hollywood sign. Legacy is what remains in people after you are no longer making every decision for them. And if Angelina's children eventually build lives that have little to do with Hollywood, that does not mean she failed to pass on her legacy. It may mean she succeeded. Because the goal of parenting is not to make children dependent on you forever. The goal is to prepare them to live without you standing over every decision. To give them enough love that they feel secure. Enough freedom that they can become independent. And enough perspective that they understand the world is bigger than themselves. Angelina has spent much of her public life trying to make the world bigger for her children. Now they are doing something similar for her. They are showing her that there is life beyond the years when they were small. There is a life beyond Hollywood. There is a life beyond the headlines. There is a life beyond the image of Angelina Jolie that the public has carried for decades. There is simply Angelina, a mother, a woman, a person still changing. And perhaps that is why this story feels different when we look at it now. For years, the public saw 6 children following their famous mother. Now, we are beginning to see 6 adults walking beside her. And someday they may walk far ahead. That is what growing up means. But the distance does not erase the connection. The child who leaves home does not stop being your child. The adult who chooses a different career does not stop carrying something you taught them. And the son or daughter who creates a completely different life does not erase the years you spent building their foundation. The relationship simply changes. And perhaps Angelina's greatest achievement as a mother was understanding that it had to change. She could not keep them children forever. She could not keep them protected forever. She could not keep the world from judging them forever. All she could do was prepare them, then trust them. And now, the 6 children are writing the next chapter themselves. Maybe that is the most beautiful part of their entire story. Angelina gave them a world. They gave her perspective. She gave them freedom. They gave her a reason to evolve. She gave them a family. They gave her a sense of purpose. And somewhere between all those exchanges, the children she once raised became the people who helped shape the woman she became. So perhaps the real story was never simply about what Angelina Jolie gave her children. It was about what happens when love moves in both directions. A mother gives, children receive, then they grow, and one day, they give something back. Not necessarily with words, not necessarily with money, not necessarily with fame. Sometimes they give it simply by becoming good human beings, by finding their own path, by becoming independent, by discovering who they are, and by reminding the person who raised them that her story is not over. Neither is theirs. The world may continue to call them the Jolie Pitt children, but eventually that will become only the beginning of their story. Because the children Angelina once carried are now carrying their own names, their own dreams, their own futures. And perhaps in the years ahead, the greatest question will no longer be what did Angelina Jolie make of her fame. It will be what did the 6 people she raised make of the lives she gave them. And when that question is finally answered, perhaps we will understand what Angelina gave her children, and what they gave her back.